So another document after the advisory circular is an order. So an FAA order, and that's really a document that the FAA publishes that really describes responsibilities and procedures for particular FAA personnel. For example, if you go to order 8110.4, that really refers to kind of all the responsibility procedures of FAA personnel when it comes to the type certificate process, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So orders really are kind of a descriptive document from the FAA. On the other hand, the notice is really just a document that provides temporary direction or a one-time announcement. Notices always have a very limited have a time limit on the amount of time they remain in effect. So an example would be a NOTAM, a notice to airman, if, for example, an airport runway is closed or an airport is closed or something else is going on due to, for example, construction. And one that actually is really interesting that I have here as an example, which is related to the stuff we talk about in this course, is 8110.92, which talks about what kind of criteria to apply to previously developed software when you start making a new software product, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. Okay, so if it comes to certification, there's really three organizations at the FAA that are involved in the certification process. You have the air traffic service providers that deal with certifying controllers and controller facilities, like the air traffic control facilities, for example. Then you have the aircraft certification services, ACS, that certifies aircraft and parts of aircraft, and they issue TCs and type certificates and supplemental type certificate, as well as technical standard orders. And then finally you have flight standards, which are really deal with operational approvals. So they certify aircraft for particular operations. For example, if an aircraft needs to be enabled to fly with a Category 3 precision approach into an airport and has to have certain equipment for it, that's what flight standards does. They give an operational approval to fly a particular type of approach into an airport, for example. Okay, let's look at some of these designs. If you look at a baseline aircraft design, for example, a Boeing aircraft or an Airbus aircraft, this is an original aircraft design that's made or designed by an aircraft manufacturer. So these typically are getting what we call a type certificate. So if you have an aircraft, a new type of aircraft, they need to get a type certificate. For example, Boeing 737-800, for example, will have a type certificate. It's a particular type. So this is really kind of for the aircraft manufacturers. The other thing that is out there is what we call a supplemental type certificate, which can be done by anyone, not just the aircraft manufacturers. It can also be the aircraft manufactured avionics equipment. And in that case, we're talking about making a modification to a production or out of production aircraft. So, for example, if a manufacturer wants to make a new function with a box system associated with a new function, they could get a supplemental type certificate to get it on a particular aircraft. Then, of course, the third option here is the approved parts, and we've already talked a couple times about technical standard order, TSO. We'll talk about all of those a little bit more. So this is the parts manufacturer approval, type of production certificate, and TSO. In general, if you look at the certification process, an applicant will apply for certification, so they will actually talk to the FAA and start the application process, and then the FAA will, together with the applicant, establish the certification basis and the policies and procedures to be applied. And the certification basis is really all the applicable FAA regulations and any binding guidance material that applies to that aircraft or that particular product at the time the certification starts taking place. Okay? So then what the applicant needs to do, he needs to show that everything he has done designing this aircraft complies And complies, really read here as is in technical agreement with, complies with these regulations. And they do this, and for this they have to submit evidence, they have to submit data, they have to allow the FAA to do inspections, they have to submit data on tests, they have to let the FAA see some of these tests. And then what the FAA is going to do is they evaluate all this evidence of compliance and makes a finding and say, well, this is all good enough, or there's a couple of things missing here and there. And then when everything is fine, the Federal Aviation Administration issues a certificate and also defines the limitations of this certificate. Now, if you look at the certification basis that the FAA put together, this, as I said before, it consists of FAA regulations, but also some other binding guidance material, like RTCA documents, for example, and this is a standalone GPS example, advisory circulars, TSOs, integration documents, other requirements documents, a whole ton of documents that are out there that are related to actually applying this standard, making a standard GPS box as a box that goes on the airplane. Well, in addition to the certification process, there's also a variety of, you have to think about these things in terms of approval processes. You know, it's not just that you get a certificate, it's actually you get a particular approval, and this approval is not always example. So if you look at the design approval, that doesn't mean that if you get an approval for a design, that you can also produce it automatically. These may be two separate approvals that you have to get from the Federal Aviation Administration. Then the installation approval is again different. So you may design a product, then you need to get production approval, and then you also need to install this on this aircraft. You need to get approval for that too. Then finally, of course, you need to use this system to fly a particular operational scenario or a particular operation. Then you need to get operational approval as well. And besides that, there's also a thing called field approval if you want to make just an alteration, a major alteration to your aircraft, for example. But you see there's a variety of different approval processes, and just because you get a certificate doesn't necessarily mean that you get all these things automatically approved. Now, the first one we're going to look at is a type certificate. We often refer to as an original design approval. So really, in this case, you're getting a design approval, so the first category, of a civil aircraft, an engine, or a propeller. Okay? If you want to make a major change to this design that's already there, you would need either a supplemental or amended type certificate. Now, if you want to look at some of the responsibilities of FAA personnel, you have to look in order 8110.4, which is regarding the type certificate. So a supplemental type certificate really is issued when an applicant has FAA approval to modify an aircraft from its original design, add a particular functionality to it, add a system to this aircraft, modifying it. Okay? So what you see in this particular case that you not just get approval for the modification, but that you also have to show how your modification affects the original design. So you're really seeing how does this new box that I'm adding to it, what impact does it have on the remainder of the design? Let's look at the basic process, and this is a little bit more extensive than the little block diagram I showed you earlier. Company has an idea for an avionics product, for example. Or an aircraft product. They check out if there's marketability and how hard it's going to be to certify it. And at this point, sometimes FAA personnel has already consulted this case. Well, if the company decides to go forward, they of course come up with a preliminary design, and this has to do with systems engineering, which is really going to be the next week's module. Well, when they get to the preliminary design, then they have to also make a certification plan. So they don't have to come up with it. Not only do they have to come up with design, a preliminary design, concept design, but they also need to come up with a plan of certification. How am I going to certify this? And how do I get the people involved? Then, when the more detail gets worked out, the detailed design, and again, we talk about the next module, at that time you see there's also a lot more FAA personnel involvement. And talk about that some more later. At that time, you have to start making things like testing plans, safety assessments, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Well, after that detailed design is done, then there must be some system testing performed, and in some cases FA witness a bunch of these tests. And then finally, you're going to install this in the aircraft and kind of complete the certification test. At this time, the FAA issues a certificate, so for example, a supplemental type certificate here, and is ready for operational approval. So for example, I added a standalone GPS box to my aircraft. I had to go through this whole set of steps, but now I have the box in the aircraft. I still need to have operational approval.